Yeah, well, again, Brad Haynes with the Table Group, been there a while. I'll start with good morning. Start with kind of my story. I grew up in Jackson, Tennessee with Joe, Southern Baptist, came to Memphis, went to Rhodes, studied religion, lost my faith because of that. Kind of was in the wilderness for a few years in my 20s, and it was getting in the Word. I was working for a landscaper, Kevin McCarter, kind of odd jobs, and he was in this men's Bible study at a local church there, and he said, and I started attending with him, and the pastor, a guy named Don Winter, said, you got to get in the Word, you got to get in the Word, you got to get in the Word. And so over that period of time, probably 26, 27, 28, 29, I just started cultivating the discipline of getting in the Word every day. And I started asking God, what do you want me to do? Because if you had looked at my life prior to that, you'd say, hey, this guy, I went to a boarding school, I went to Macaulay in Chattanooga, and then I went to Rhodes, and people are thinking, man, this guy's really setting up for success. And I just squandered it. I just squandered my time at Rhodes. I had a 2.37, that was my GPA. And so anyway, from that point forward, I went to work at a Christian children's home for kids that were in state custody. Some of my colleagues were taking graduate classes down at Freed-Hardeman University, so I decided to take a class or two. The next thing you know, I'm graduating with a 4.0 while working full time. Then I go to seminary, get a doctorate in clinical psychology, master's in theology. One of my professors had just started reading The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. You guys are familiar with that book, right? And so I get back here, I'm practicing therapy at the Christian Psychological Center, doing individual, adult, and marital therapy. And at some point in that, the insurance companies start trying to tell me how to do my job and who I can see, and we've got this really long waiting list. And I started, really struggling with, do I want them to tell me how to do my work? And so I started looking at consulting, reached out to my old professor, and at one point he said, Brad, Pat is coming to St. Jude to speak. You should go meet with him. And this is a really long story, but suffice it to say, it's not easy to get on the St. Jude campus if you're not invited, especially to an event that's just for their senior leaders. So what I want you to hear from this, what I want you to hear from all this story, but especially this part, is God had a major hand in me meeting Pat that day. And I arranged a tour to get on campus that day, and I met Pat and got to spend about an hour with him. He was on campus for half a day, and I happened to just hook up with him right at lunchtime. And it was at that encounter that he offered me a job. And if you don't see God's hand in that little snippet of the story, I need to tell that story again. So anyway, that is how I got this job. And what I would say to you is, if you very earnestly seek God and ask Him what it is He's called you to do, He will answer that question. He may not answer it brightly for the next 3 decades, but over time He will just unfold it to you. And even now, I still ask Him, who are the clients I should work with? What should I be doing with my time? What's interesting about The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which Pat wrote probably 21, 22 years ago, to this day, that book still sells 3,000 or 4,000 copies a week. And it's like the number 3 business book 20 years ago. And if you were to ask Pat, he would just kind of say, we had no idea the impact this book would have. The other thing Pat would say is, all the stuff that you see in his books are God's principles. He just Pat finds a way to make them simple. Pat is what he would call an evangelical Catholic, and man, he goes to Mass daily. He loves the Lord. He loves the Lord. I was with Pat a couple of weeks ago, which is a treat. The other thing I would say, as it relates to the Beatitudes, meekness, is there's a couple of books that Pat has written that would talk about, so what we're going to talk about with the Advantage is kind of the model, the methodology. But a couple of books that he wrote, the first one here is The Motive, which talks about the difference between rewards-based leadership. Do I get the corner office? What do I get paid? Who's going to do what for me? And responsibility-based leadership, which is kind of that I am to whom much is given, much is expected. I am responsible, and how do I live out that responsibility? So that is a really good primer. And if you ask Pat, he would say, I wish I had written this one first, because this is the one that sets everything up for success, is having a humble, God-centered, responsibility-based leader. And then the second book that Pat wrote that you may have heard of is The Ideal Team Player. And the ideal team, so when he wrote the 5 dysfunctions of a team, people would say, yeah, I get the team, but what if I'm hiring for an individual team player? What should I look for? And the essence of that was humble, hungry, smart. Humble, putting others before yourself, the team before yourself. Hungry, give me something to do, give me responsibility. And I hope that when you guys talked a little bit about meekness is not just like weakness, being a doormat. Meekness is kind of like a self-awareness and a sense of putting your trust in God rather than the world, but it's certainly not weakness. And then the third one is smart, and when he says smart, he doesn't mean IQ, he means EQ. Am I tuned into what's going on with others? Can I empathize with others, right? So I would direct you to those two if you want to think about kind of what precedes healthy organizations and helps fuel them. When I think of organizations, I think of an organization being as small as a couple or as big as a Fortune 50 company. IP would be an organization, right? But organizations can be really small or really big, but these principles apply to all of them, okay? The first requirement for success is that you be smart, okay? What does that mean? Smart is usually all the stuff that's measurable, okay? So if you think about strategy, marketing, finance, technology, if we're thinking about medicine, we're thinking about evidence-based practices, what do the clinical trials tell us, all the stuff that's measurable. If we're thinking about financial planning, we're thinking about market returns and yields on fixed income instruments, and just all the stuff that's easy to measure, okay? If you don't get that right, you will fail. You gotta be smart. And then over on the healthy side, we talk about minimal politics, and one of the ways we define politics is when what you say changes based on who's in the room. You with me? Healthy organizations just kind of say the same thing to everyone. They don't have a different version for different people. Another way to think about politics is trying to kind of climb the ladder at the expense of others. There's nothing wrong with climbing the ladder. You just want to do it along with others rather than holding information in order to benefit yourself over others. There's kind of this collective mentality. So we've got minimal politics, we've got minimal confusion. Minimal confusion of what? Of why we get out of bed every morning, the superstars that we want to clone, how do they behave? How are we going to be successful? What's most important right now? We want folks to be excited to come to work, and because of that, they'll be productive. And then we want to keep our best people. We've got low turnover of our best people. Does that make sense? And so then oftentimes we say that to leaders and they say, oh, I really need some of that healthy. And then invariably they gravitate back over to the smart. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they gravitate back over to the smart? But that's right, it's what we studied at school, it's easy to quantify, it's easily measured, right? It's kind of black and white. Whereas on the healthy, it could be a little gray, like what exactly do we mean by cohesive team, right? And so what we believe is that healthy is the multiplier of your smarts. We'd rather have a team of healthy people who are average smarts rowing in the same direction rather than a team of geniuses that are highly dysfunctional. Make sense? So here's the question. If you want to be healthy physically, what are some disciplines you can practice? Well, thinking about physical health, right? Eat right, exercise, sleep. So if we want to look at organizational health, there are also some disciplines we can practice. And so these are the 4 disciplines. The first one is build a cohesive leadership team. When we say cohesive, what we mean is they understand and appreciate and value one another's differences. They can be vulnerable with one another. They are humble. They can engage in really healthy conflict, ideological debate. I think you guys have talked about some of this, hadn't you? They have commitment. They can force clarity and closure around these conversations. They hold one another accountable. It's peer-to-peer accountability, not leader accountability, not just leader accountability. And then there's a sense of shared results. Okay, we own this collectively. We're not doing this in silos. Okay? And the other thing I'll say to you is this: if you're in an organization, especially if you're an attorney, kind of in a partnership model, you may be organized more as a working group or a golf team rather than a basketball team. And that is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with which game you're playing. Just know that there are limits to, in certain games, you've got to be on the same team. You got to be on the same page. You got to be communicating up and down the floor. And on other teams, on a golf team, you put the same jersey on, you get in the van, you go shoot your score, and then you come back, right? So just be mindful that somewhere on this continuum between I go shoot my scores and we add them up collectively versus we have got to be in sync up and down the court all day, every day, you're somewhere in there and these principles still apply, okay? So that's the first discipline, cohesion. Second discipline is clarity. We have got to get clear on 6 simple questions. Why do we exist? How do we behave? What do we do? How will we succeed? What's most important right now? And who must do what? Okay? Third is over-communicate. Clarity. That clarity that we just created with those 6 questions, we have to over-communicate that. George Bernard Shaw said, the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. Let that sink in for a minute. And one of the things that I think about, because one of the questions I ask myself on that third discipline is this: why might really good, humble, well-intentioned leaders fail at over-communicating? What would lead to that? What do you think? Yes, they assume that folks are already clear on it, right? Yeah. And for some personality types, it might be condescending. It's like, well, Joe already knows that. I'm not going to tell him again. He's a smart guy, right? Why else? Yeah, if you can keep it simple and you can keep it clear. One of the other things I like to say to folks is communication is a receiver-based phenomenon. It is not a sender-based phenomenon. Just because I say something doesn't mean that it was received the way I intended it. And one of the things that I think about is, does it align behaviorally with that clarity? So if we talk about humble, hungry, smart, and I say something, until those behaviors align with humble, hungry, smart, I haven't done a good job communicating. Make sense? And then the fourth one is reinforced through human systems, and that's going to be, let's go back to physical health for just a minute. There are going to be some systems that you have related to, well, actually, let me shift gears with this audience. Instead of talking about physical health, let's talk about spiritual health. What are some systems that you can put in place to reinforce getting in the Word, attending worship, praying, these sorts of things? The systems are going to be, have your Bible right there next to where, you're going to drink your coffee. Making sure that there's a routine of getting to church every Sunday. Praying every night before you go to bed, praying every morning when you wake up. These are things that just happen over time because you've chosen to systematize them. Does that make sense? And so then these disciplines, we just practice over and over and over again. And I'll tell you this, there are organizations out there that have never heard of Pat Lencioni that are exceedingly healthy. And if you notice them, you don't need the table group to be healthy. They're doing this. They've got a cohesive team, they're clear, they're over-communicating, and they're reinforcing. I've heard this phrase recently, when you've got your health, you have 1,000 problems. When you don't have your health, you have one problem, right? And that's what you're talking about. Like when things are crazily dysfunctional, we've got to solve it. We can't get around it. But when things are pretty good, we're okay. And I feel like you guys have talked about this some, right? So if we look at the base of the pyramid, we're talking about trust. We are not talking about predictive trust, okay? Predictive trust will tell you that, you know, who's going to show up first to the meeting, who's going to speak out first, you know, when you ask a question in the meeting. That's predictive trust. We're talking about vulnerability-based trust, the ability to say, I'm wrong, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I'm not very good at this, okay? And if we have vulnerability-based trust, we can engage in healthy conflict, which is basically ideological debate. We are just debating ideas to come up with the best decisions. And if you've got vulnerability-based trust, it's not personal. You're not trying to win. If you don't have trust, it becomes kind of political, like, I need to win, right? So what's the point of healthy conflict? To make good decisions. We want to broaden our ideas and our choices, and then in that third behavior, which is commitment, we want to force clarity and closure and say, okay, we understand the options, we're going with this option. And it's the leader's job in all of these to go first, being vulnerable, mining for conflict, forcing clarity and closure. Third behavior is accountability. Accountability is around performance and behaviors. So performance would be, Joe, you said you were going to get that report to us. Where is it? Behaviors would be, you're showing up late to the meetings, or you didn't share your idea within the team meeting, you waited until afterwards to share it because you didn't want to offend somebody. That's a behavioral thing that we need to work on, right? If the leader doesn't hold the team accountable and there's not a standard for that, the team will not hold one another accountable. So the leader has to go first, but ultimately, if you were to think about the best teams you've ever been on, it's peer-to-peer. You just feel like you gotta perform for that person next to you, right? And then lastly, it's results. And so there's this sense of shared results. Are we doing this collectively? Those are the 5 behaviors that we would want a team to work through in order to be cohesive. And then we just want to get clear on those 6 clarity questions. And why do we exist and how do we behave? Those have been there since the founding of the organization. Before you do the exercise of clarifying, those have already existed. And it goes back to the founding of the organization. What do we do and how do we succeed? That's going to have more to do with the political environment, the economic environment. You know, these folks that have been selling on Amazon, the less than $800 tariff thing, what's that called? Yeah. They've probably had to kind of rethink through how do they succeed and what do they do based on that. That's more of a political, economic impact on their business, right? And then the last 2 are what's most important and who must do what. This is a pretty big overview of like what org health looks like, right? And the thing that I would want you to remember more than anything is those 4 disciplines. The thing I love about this model is those 4 disciplines and these 5 behaviors are diagnostic tools. So you can ask yourself at any point in time, hey, how do you think we're doing on these 4 behaviors? Are we cohesive? Are we clear? Are we over communicating? How are our people receiving it? And then on these 5 behaviors, you can evaluate those. And we actually have an online assessment to evaluate those 5 behaviors. How are we doing? Which of those should we work on? How do we get better? Okay, so let me jump back to meekness for just a quick second. When I think about these 5 behaviors, and I think about vulnerability-based trust, that is massive amounts of humility and self-awareness right there, right? When you think about conflict, it's not like every opinion has equal relevance. Some opinions are better than others, but you want to seek to understand first, then to be understood, like Stephen Covey said. So there's a humility when it comes to the conflict. There's not a lot of pride in that, because the more humble you are, the more you're actually going to unearth the ideas that you need. And then if you jump on up to accountability, I think accountability Pat Lencioni would say, if we're all here for the right reasons and for the mission, and we've done a good job with these other behaviors, accountability is really about protecting promises. It's one of the most loving things you can do, is to help someone be the best version of themselves personally and professionally. But that's not going to happen if you're not aligned around mission and you haven't behaved with these other behaviors first.
Bad behavior within an organization?
Yeah, I love that question. That is a really good question. Because, and I think this, again, I used to do marital therapy, and so oftentimes a couple comes in, and if they've had, a special needs child and the death of a parent and someone lost their job, you need to identify for them pretty early on, man, you've got all these stressors really coming down on this marriage. And when they're both thinking, no, it's her or it's him, right? And the same is true with organizations. I've got a CEO right now up in New Jersey who runs the U.S. arm of a global dairy cooperative. They do about 13 billion a year euros, and he does about 200 million. That's the U.S. operation. They got a big dairy in Wisconsin. Well, tariffs, milk prices have a massive influence on that. He's trying to compete with organizations like Kraft here in the U.S., and he has no say whatsoever over milk prices and the tariffs. And then he has an aging infrastructure at the dairy in Wisconsin, and he needs about $20 million to upgrade the facility. And so I love the question, because like in our personal lives, we need to identify what are the things we have influence over and what are the things that we don't have influence over. And we need to identify those things that we don't have influence over because they do have an effect, but then we need to shift our attention to be proactive with the things that we do have influence over. And use our influence to change those things. Like if there's a law that's bad and we have some influence to change it, I would encourage doing that, but realize that until that happens, you've got these other areas that you can work on. Hopefully you've had that person around for a while and they've been able to be a part of a team, to observe these 5 behaviors, that they understand what the clarity is. If they have not been a part of the organization and they're coming in, you are going to want to evaluate them across humble, hungry, smart, right? Can they be humble? And Pat would argue that you want to do that not in an interview setting, but just take them with you to like Starbucks, take them to lunch, see how they treat the wait staff as far as humility goes and people smarts and that sort of thing. But yeah, as far as succession planning goes, you want to see how have they performed with teams in the past? Why are they aligned with the mission? Do they understand your core values and how you're going to behave? These sorts of things. You want to be really clear on the front end, and quite frankly, you want to do it for their benefit too, not just for the benefit of the organization, but for their benefit, because for them to be effective and have dignity and succeed, they need to be aligned with it. And so your ability to be really clear with them is doing them a favor as well, because if it's not a good fit, they're not going to succeed. I'll tell you how I think about this, and I've never been a miner, but I could imagine someone in South Africa going deep below the earth, like way below the earth, with a hard hat on and a light and steel-toed boots, and there is risk to their life. Like they're looking for something precious, but it's hot and it's dusty and it feels kind of dangerous. And they're trying to extract something really precious, really valuable. Does that make sense? So that's the way I think about the word mining. And so then when I think about conflict, you have to extract it. You have to draw it out. And so let's imagine that we've got sales and marketing and operations and finance, and we say, hey, we really need to do this big marketing push, and it's going to cost us $1 million. And These guys are all on board with it. Sales, marketing, ops, like, yeah, we need this. And I say to the finance person, like, I'm going to need you to weigh in here because, it's like, so we're thinking we're going to make this decision and this is great, but it's like, how's this going to impact us? And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to draw out what's the impact this is going to have on us, right? And so mining for it, when you are the team leader, and the team leader is not the only one who needs to do this. Everyone needs to do it, but if you look at the next behavior is commitment. If we've done a good job with conflict and mining for it, we've drawn out all the stuff that we want to be aware of that would prevent us from fully committing to it. Yeah, and if you're not clear on what we're committing to, how can they be accountable? My thinking is you've already got some stakeholders in the community, donors, board members. You've got some stakeholders who really care about you and that organization succeeding. I would get together with those stakeholders and I would take a stab at getting some of this clarity, right? And so The Advantage is a good book for that. The Advantage is just looking at those questions in Discipline 2. And then I would also, as Stephen Covey says, begin with the end in mind. Okay, so let's fast forward and let's look at some of the students that this school has produced. How do they behave? How do they treat other students? What's their character like as far as grit and resilience given the adversity that they might be facing at home, in the classroom? Being a student's hard no matter what school you go to. And so you want to get some alignment around what that finished product looks like, right? And then you want to come back to what is our mission? Like, why are we getting out of bed every morning? The superstars, and this is where it gets interesting within a school, is you've got to differentiate between the students and the staff. It's kind of like with a church too, Brittany. It's like, yeah, at a church, if we're successful, we're thinking about the folks who attend the church, but how do we want the people that we employ to behave? And sometimes that can be while a lot of it will be very similar, some of it can be slightly different. So think about the best school folks you've ever encountered and make a list of what are the attributes they have. And then that'll help you get at how do we behave. As you think about, and then once you get clear on that, once you get clear on the mission and you get clear on those behaviors, then you'll want to kind of build that into your interview process for the teachers and stuff, and you want to tease out, are they aligned with the mission, and do I think they can show up the way we need them to show up behaviorally, right? Once you get that, once you get your team, once you beyond the stakeholders and you get your leadership team, then you want to just have conversations with them around how are we going to succeed. There's an academic piece, there's a behavioral piece, there's kind of a structural piece. But The Advantage would be a good one for that. This is going to sound really trite. Don't underestimate prayer, right? Because God will show you every single day. There's tons of books out there, but every day, you may need a specific book, and only He can know that based on where the journey you're on. Great point, John. I'm thinking about, we were talking about Harvest earlier, and Kennan, the senior pastor, before he started that church, sought out like way up into the double digits a lot of his mentors around, hey, I'm getting ready to build a church. I want it to be economically diverse. I want it to be racially diverse. I want it to be age diverse. And he asked all these different mentors, a lot of which were older, what do I need to do and what do I need to avoid, right? Before he even got the thing really off the ground. So that, I totally concur with that, John. Pat would tell you the very best leaders, the ones who are the healthiest leaders, you have no idea who they are, because they're just kind of these unsung heroes that are doing their job. They didn't go, they're not the Larry Ellisons or whatever. And if you think about folks who aren't Christians judging Christians, which ones are they going to be looking at? The ones that are in the news, the ones that have fallen, rather than the ones who are just humbly every day serving, putting others first. So there are a lot of, and it's interesting, Joe, that you say that, because I grew up in a family where my father was an entrepreneur, my grandfather was an entrepreneur, and I get to college and I'm thinking, man, this business world where you have these results and these quarterly results, to me it felt very hard, and I was always more wired for kind of this like soft people, care about people, therapist, and I thought these were two opposite worlds. And when I read the 5 dysfunctions of a team, I'm like, wait a minute, this guy gets it. And it was really kind of like a divine epiphany. It was a divine realization of like, these are not separate worlds. These fit together. And then little by little by little, it's the most ironic thing you could ever think of. You took a guy who was running away from business, who had this legacy of business, and now to this day, God uses me with these senior-most business leaders to advise them. I have never been a business person. I've never been an executive. There's a guy that I coach right now. He was the 3rd employee of a company that builds data centers. It's a $13 billion company. Because he was the 3rd employee, he's worth about $100 million. I coach him. Well, I don't know that I coach him, but every 2 weeks we have a call for an hour where I'm just a sounding board for him. And if you ask yourself the question, how on earth did Brad get to do that? I hope the answer you will comes back to only God. Only God can take a guy who had such bad grades, who didn't care anything about business, but chose to follow the path that God was leading, and God brought that about. Does that resonate with you? I hope that doesn't sound like self-promotion. It's very much, if you let God lead and you trust Him, He will put you where He's gifted you, and you will thrive. You just have to surrender.
Absolutely none. From leadership.
Good question. I think if you can get clear in understanding what leadership is trying to accomplish and where they might see some pain points, that would be the first place to look for clarity. Because now you're using their destination, their goal, their declared goal of what they're trying to accomplish, and you're using their understanding of this isn't working. And so you're saying, how can we get better at that? How do we understand the problem? How do we understand how to fix the problem? So just being humbly curious, that's what I would recommend. I'll tell you this before we wrap up. Just like physical health is not knowing all the science that the physicians might know. Physical health, we've all in this room got enough knowledge to know how to be physically healthy. It's the application of that knowledge, okay? And it's the same way with organizational health. I hope that you didn't hear a bunch of words in here that are new jargon, new Harvard Business School jargon. It's pretty simple stuff, but it requires a lot of discipline to bring this about. And so just know, when we see folks succeed, it's because they realize they're going to have to pursue this for the rest of their careers. It's not just I had a salad yesterday, I'm good for the month, if we want to talk about physical health. So it's just this, and it's like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 4 steps forward, 1 step back. You just got to stick with it. Father, we love you. We are so grateful to you for giving us this day, this beautiful fall day. We know, Father, that your kingdom is among us, and we ask that you would show us how we fit into that kingdom today. We acknowledge you as holy. We pray that you would help us to live lives of humility that honor and recognize you and that affirm the dignity of each of those that we will come in contact with today as made in your image. I am grateful for Howard and Brittany, Emmanuel, just for this organization, Father. Just pray that you would continue to bless them as they humbly seek you and building your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.